In 1930, contractors building New York's tallest towers operated under a chilling formula: one dead worker for every floor completed. They called it the blood budget, a line item as routine as steel deliveries. Foremen did not hide the numbers. They factored them into payroll. Yet thousands of men still showed up each morning, climbed into open elevators, and walked beams with nothing but air beneath their boots. The real question is not why so many died building America's skyline. It is why anyone agreed to climb at all, and what drove an entire industry to treat death as the cost of doing business. The 1930s opened with a frenzy that defied both gravity and common sense. Three titans were rising simultaneously in Manhattan: the Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building, and 40 Wall Street. Each project raced against the others, driven by egos, deadlines, and the promise of holding the title of the world's tallest. The competition wasn't just professional, it was personal. Architects and developers monitored rival sites with binoculars, adjusting plans mid-construction to edge out competitors by a few dozen feet. The Empire State Building broke ground in January 1930. Within 410 days, it stood complete at 1,454 feet, an achievement that still stuns engineers today. At its peak, more than 3,400 workers swarmed the site, laying 4.5 floors every week. Steel arrived by rail, was trucked to the curb, and hoisted directly to the frame, sometimes within minutes of leaving the flatbed. There was no storage, no buffer, no margin for delay. The Chrysler Building's spire was assembled in secret inside the building's fire shaft, then raised in 90 minutes to steal the height record from its downtown rival. This kind of speed wasn't just ambitious, it was reckless. Every shortcut, every compressed schedule, every demand for one more floor before sundown pushed workers closer to the edge. And the edge on these sites was literal. The men who built the 1930s skyline came from everywhere and nowhere. Italian immigrants fresh off steamships from Naples, Mohawk ironworkers from Kanawake, near Montreal, who had earned a reputation for fearlessness on bridge projects decades earlier, unemployed farmers fleeing the Dust Bowl, veterans of the Great War looking for any job that paid. By 1930, the Great Depression had gutted the American economy. Unemployment soared past 25% in some cities. A job on the high steel paid $15 a day, nearly double what a factory worker might earn if he could find work at all. For many, the danger was abstract. Starvation was not. Hiring halls opened before dawn. Men lined up in the dark, hoping a foreman would point a finger their way. Those chosen climbed onto hoist platforms and rode open-air elevators into the sky, often with no training beyond a handshake and a hard hat. Apprenticeships that once took years were compressed into days. A man might learn the basics of riveting on Monday and be working 50 stories up by Friday. This desperation created a workforce that could not afford to complain. Injuries went unreported. Men hid broken fingers and gashed arms to avoid losing their spots. The unspoken rule was simple: if you could not work, 100 others were waiting to take your place. The official death toll for the Empire State Building stands at 5. That number has been repeated so often it feels like fact. But it was always a fiction. Contractors in the 1930s had little incentive to report fatalities accurately. Insurance claims were costly, and investigations slowed work. Many deaths were quietly classified as off-site accidents, even when workers died from injuries sustained on the job. Men who fell from scaffolding and lingered for days in hospitals were not counted as construction deaths if they died after leaving the site. Immigrant workers without papers often vanished from the record entirely, their families too afraid or too far away to demand answers. Historians who have examined hospital admissions, union records, and newspaper accounts estimate the true death toll on major 1930s projects was 3 to 5 times higher than official figures suggest. On the Empire State Building alone, some researchers believe as many as 50 men may have died, though the exact number will never be known. The Chrysler Building's records are even murkier. Newspapers from 1929 and 1930 mention fatal falls, but no comprehensive tally was ever published. The pattern repeated across the city: deaths acknowledged in passing, then forgotten. Falling was the most common way to die, but not the only one. The construction site of a 1930s skyscraper was a landscape of hazards, each one capable of killing a man in seconds. Riveting gangs worked with red-hot steel pulled from portable forges. A rivet that slipped from the catcher's bucket could burn through clothing and flesh before anyone could react. Men on lower floors learned to listen for the clatter of dropped tools, diving for cover at the first sound. Derricks swung 2-ton beams through the air on cables that frayed and snapped without warning. A load released at the wrong moment could crush a man flat or sweep him off a beam into the void. Hoist operators, working from street level or lower floors, often could not see the men guiding their loads. Communication depended on hand signals relayed through a chain of spotters, a system that failed whenever fog, rain, or simple fatigue blurred the message. Scaffolding collapsed, planks rotted, temporary flooring gave way underfoot. Men slipped on ice in winter and lost their grip on sweat-slicked steel in summer. The wind, funneled between towers, could gust past 40 miles per hour without warning, turning a routine crossing into a death trap. Even the elevators were dangerous. Open cage hoists carried men and materials up the outside of the frame, exposed to weather and debris. A stumble at the wrong moment could send a worker tumbling out before the cage reached its floor. In the 1930s, the concept of workplace safety as a legal right barely existed. The first meaningful federal labor protections would not arrive until 1936 with the Walsh-Healey Act, and even that law applied only to government contractors. Private construction sites operated under a patchwork of state rules, most of them toothless. New York had a labor department, but inspectors were few and visits rare. When violations were found, fines were minimal, often less than the cost of a single day's delay. Contractors calculated that it was cheaper to pay the occasional penalty than to slow down for safety. Workers' compensation laws existed in most states by the 1930s, but payouts were meager. A widow might receive a few $100s for her husband's death, barely enough to cover funeral costs. The families of immigrant workers, especially those without legal status, often received nothing at all. Unions pushed for safer conditions, but their power was limited. The Great Depression had weakened organized labor across the country. Strikes were risky when replacement workers stood ready at every hiring hall. Most unions focused on wages and hours, leaving safety to individual judgment. The result was a system built on acceptable losses. Death was not a scandal to be avoided. It was a variable to be managed, weighed against the cost of nets, harnesses, and slower schedules. Among the iron workers, danger was not just accepted, it was worn as a badge. The men who walked the high steel developed a culture that prized fearlessness above almost everything else. To show hesitation, to ask for a safety line, was to mark yourself as weak. Weakness had no place on the beams. This ethos had deep roots. The Mohawk ironworkers who formed the backbone of many crews traced their tradition back to the 1886 construction of the Victoria Bridge in Canada. Employers noticed that Mohawk laborers showed no fear of heights and began recruiting them for the most dangerous assignments. By the 1930s, Kahnawake had become a pipeline for high steel workers, with sons following fathers and uncles onto the beams of Manhattan. For these men, the refusal to use safety gear was not ignorance, it was identity. The belts available at the time were heavy, awkward, and prone to snagging. But even if better equipment had existed, many would have refused it. To clip on was to admit doubt, to break faith with the crew, to dishonor the memory of those who had come before. This culture of bravado was reinforced by the pace of the work itself. There was no time to be careful. Deadlines demanded speed, and speed demanded trust. Trust that the man beside you would hold his balance, catch the signal, steady the beam. Hesitation could kill not just you, but the worker next to you. Not every tragedy went unnoticed. In 1930, a young Italian immigrant named Giuseppe Moretti fell 40 stories from the Empire State Building's frame. His body landed on a flatbed truck loaded with steel, in full view of dozens of workers and passers-by. The New York Daily News ran a photograph the next day, grainy but unmistakable. A crowd gathered around the truck, faces turned upward, the building's skeleton looming behind. Moretti was 22. He had been in the country for less than a year. His family in Sicily learned of his death by telegram, weeks after the funeral. There was no investigation, no inquiry, no change in procedure. The next morning, work resumed. Stories like Moretti's were common enough that they rarely made the papers. A fall here, a crushed hand there, a man who simply never came home. The city was building too fast to stop for grief. The skyline demanded its tribute, and the workers paid it. On the job, death was handled with a grim practicality. When a man fell, his body was removed quickly, often before the blood had dried. Tools were collected, the spot was checked for hazards, and work continued. Foremen sometimes passed a hat for the widow, collecting a few dollars from each man on the crew. It was the closest thing to ceremony the site allowed. The seeds of change were planted in the 1930s, though the harvest would take decades. Labor organizers, horrified by the toll, began documenting deaths and injuries in ways that official records ignored. Journalists and reformers published exposes that shocked middle-class readers, even as the skyline they admired continued to rise. The Walsh-Healey Act of 1936 marked a turning point, requiring basic safety standards on federal contracts. But private construction remained largely unregulated until the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, which created OSHA and established enforceable rules for fall protection. By then, the men who had built the Empire State and Chrysler buildings were old or gone. Their sons and grandsons inherited a different world, one where harnesses were mandatory, nets were standard, and death was no longer budgeted into the schedule. Today, a construction worker who refuses to tie off faces immediate dismissal. Inspectors visit sites unannounced, armed with the authority to shut down entire projects. The death rate in American construction has fallen by more than 90% since the 1930s. Yet the memory of what came before lingers in every safety briefing, every training video, every regulation written in the language of lives lost. The towers of the 1930s still stand, their frames as solid as the day they were riveted. Millions pass beneath them every year, rarely glancing up, never thinking of the men who died to place each beam. But the steel remembers. Every joint, every connection is a record of risk accepted and lives spent. The blood budget is closed now, struck from the ledger by decades of reform and regulation. Yet the question it raises has never fully been answered. How much is progress worth? What price is too high? The workers of the 1930s made their choice, or had it made for them, by poverty, pride, and the roaring demand of a city in a hurry. Today, we build higher and faster than ever, with tools those men could not have imagined. But the skyline they left behind is a reminder that every achievement casts a shadow. The courage to climb was never in doubt. The courage to demand something better took longer to find. What risks do we still accept without question? The answer may be closer than we think.